I'd like to note, though, that Kaplan is the recipient of many awards and honors and has been named as one of the 50 most influential people in American healthcare, among other honors. Art, it's a big pleasure having you as a colleague, as a well-known, renowned bioethicist, and to me, particularly as a friend. It's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with Talia, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you all. Hopefully, we'll be able to have some question and answer and make this a very interactive hour. My friend Talia has also said that she will ask some questions after I give some opening remarks on issues around vaccination. So that's what I'm going to do, is start by talking about that a little bit, present some of the issues that have emerged here in vaccination, and then we can, then we'll talk, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Floor is yours, Art.
Okay. So vaccination, particularly in the American context, has been seen as the key to conquering the COVID pandemic. Under the Trump administration, which is ending in the United States today in about 1 hour, they put all of their resources into discovering vaccines, paying for research for vaccines in the hope that they would come quickly and allow for control of the virus. So their strategy was not to worry so much about masks, not to worry about social distancing, not to worry too much about testing, but really, if you will, to take a metaphor from gambling, to put all of their chips on the vaccine number. This led to extensive amounts of money being made available in two ways. The American government paid for a lot of research done in the US on vaccines. It also paid for buying vaccines, that is, getting supplies in advance, large amounts of vaccine, even though they didn't know if the vaccines would work. So they made a gamble that vaccines would appear, and they told companies to manufacture vaccines so that there would be a supply if one or more of the vaccines that were being researched should be successful. The target was a vaccine that could be 50% or better effective. That's what our regulatory agencies here were looking for. They also partnered with companies in other countries. Some of you know the Pfizer vaccine is a collaboration with a German company. There was money given to other companies in Europe. At the same time as this was occurring, research was going on in China, in Russia, to develop vaccines. However, their efforts have not been so transparent. Claims are made about the success and safety of Chinese vaccines, but they have not been published, and we don't see, if you will, the data that supports those claims in journals or online. So you have to take on trust what the authorities say about the safety and efficacy of their vaccines. Nevertheless, they too made big pushes into vaccines and have a number of them that have been started to be distributed. So what are the issues around vaccines given this push, particularly from the US, but somewhat worldwide, to find a vaccine? One was people knew that they had to do it quickly. So the faster a vaccine could be approved, the better for public health. Historically, the fastest vaccine ever made and distributed was 4 years. And that was a mumps vaccine, maybe a decade, 15 years ago. The average for vaccine development has been historically 10 years. It's taken 10 years because you have to do animal and lab studies to find out whether you can develop something that will kill a virus or a bacteria. So vaccines like tetanus or measles or mumps, polio, hepatitis, these have all taken a very long time. Bench work, a couple years, then large-scale trials that have taken a few years, involving 30, 40, 50,000 people in randomized clinical trials with placebo arms. Vaccine trials are always very big, much bigger than drug trials, because you know that you're going to be vaccinating a large number of people. Many more people will get vaccinated than get drugs. And that exposure makes people want to study them more extensively. And then you have to then set up a manufacturing capability, which private companies won't do until they're sure that they have a very good chance of getting government approval for their vaccine. That's a couple years. It takes literally a few years to build the factories, start the vaccine production, get it distributed. So that's where you get, 10 years of, on average, to get a vaccine done. Now, many of you know that vaccines were found and approved both in China, but also in the US and Britain in less than a year. So how could that happen? It gave concern to many people that it looked like these vaccines were being rushed or hurried. The American term for it was warp speed, which comes out of science fiction shows where somebody travels at the speed of light, and it's called warp speed. That description, speedy, quick, rapid, I think left many Americans and people around the world somewhat nervous that these vaccines had not been shown safe or effective in terms of full studies and getting adequate information. So the first issue that has come up for vaccines are the ones that are being put out there safe? And are they effective? And will they have side effects? And how long will they work? There are also questions about, do you need to get them annually, or how long will they last? And are there going to be any long-term side effects after 3 years or 4 years or 5 years? The vaccines in the US basically were startlingly good. Pfizer and Moderna, two companies that had already built platforms, animal and laboratory, to study genetically engineered vaccines, were able to get data on randomized trials and heavily recruit with all-out efforts by last December. And they were submitting data to US regulatory authorities and British regulatory authorities saying that their vaccines had 95% or better efficacy in controlling disease and preventing severe illness. That's unbelievable. We rarely see any vaccine hitting that level of success or benefit. And they said that they had very little indication after 6 months of study of any side effects or problems. Now, it is true that most side effects from vaccines are seen within the first 6 months, and they weren't seeing any. So government authorities in Britain and the US approved those two vaccines for what's called emergency use. Basically, they said, we have an emergency. There's a public health emergency. The COVID-19 is a plague. It's causing grave harm to people, to the economy. And we need to have these vaccines out there quickly. We can't wait for them to finish their trials. We're going to approve them on the data, partial data that they submitted, but it looks so good and verified, if you will, by data safety and monitoring boards, an external board that has no connection to the company that says the data looks good as well. The FDA in the US, a British regulatory authority said, we're approving this and you can start distributing vaccine. So to summarize, the vaccines were done quickly, and that scared people. The story about why they could be done so quickly, because they already had an established platform Moderna and Pfizer. They didn't need to do animal and bench studies. That was all done. They were able to recruit very quickly because resources were really spent to let them do that. And they'd already manufactured the supply. They didn't have to wait to build factories or do anything. The government had already paid for many, many doses to be there. And so that's how the timeline got compacted or shortened so that these could be out there. Still, many, many people in the US and elsewhere have said, we are nervous about cutting corners. We are worried that the data is incomplete. We are worried that you can't answer questions like long-term side effects. As many of you know, there are also people historically who've just been opposed to vaccination on various grounds. We can talk about that. And they have said, we're not taking this vaccine. We don't like vaccines. And they have fueled the idea that shortcuts, cutting corners, haste, going too fast has been behind these emergency approvals. So we have a big issue of trust in vaccines in the US. We have an issue of trust in vaccines in Europe. When these vaccines are now being made available, many, many people are refusing them, probably refusal rates 30, 40% on the part of older people who are being offered the vaccine, and in some instances, healthcare workers, particularly nurses and nurses' aides in long-term care facilities. So refusals are high. That raises an ethics question about what do you do about that? How do you manage people being nervous about taking vaccines? So that's one of our first issues is we have these things, they got approved, but there is a lot of public distrust. And as some of you know, the distrust is also based in the idea that the previous administration of Trump pushed the regulators to get the vaccines approved quickly for political purposes. They did do that. I'm not sure that the regulatory agencies buckled or gave in to that pressure, but it was highly publicized, again, making people nervous that politics, ideology, an attempt to get reelected by claiming success with vaccines left them approved in an inadequate way. So distrust is a big issue, and we're going to see it in many countries and many contexts. The fact that these vaccines are out there has led to a second problem. The trials that are going on of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are still attempting to study what's happening to people who got them after the 6 months and even after the emergency use approval. But the ethics problem is once you have emergency use, can you continue these trials longer to see if there are any more effects or how long the vaccine works for, whether you need a booster? And one question that has not been fully answered is, while the vaccines seem to keep people healthy at a very high rate, 95%, do they stop you from transmitting virus to other people? You could still be healthy and yet be a carrier, as we know, of COVID. And we don't have data yet that says people who respond well to the vaccines are not spreading it to other people, even if they feel fine, even if they're not going to the hospital when they're infected, can they still give it to others? So there's a lot of questions that people still want answered. But the people in the trials have said, many of them, I don't want to be in the trial anymore. I don't want to be studied anymore. I want to drop out. You have to unblind the trial. You have to tell me if I'm in the placebo group. I want to go get the emergency use vaccine. I want to get Moderna or Pfizer, even if I'm in your studies, because I'm in a risk group. Or because having agreed to be a volunteer in a study, I should get priority because I took the risk of being exposed to the experimental vaccine. So those trials are falling apart. And I don't think we're going to be able to see them extended because many, many people have dropped out. Other vaccines are in the pipeline. Johnson & Johnson has one. Novavax has one. AstraZeneca has one. Johnson & Johnson says it has enough data collected from its study to seek approval probably next month. We're going to see more vaccine supply available. It's a different kind of vaccine, but we don't have to get into that. And AstraZeneca, similarly, while they had some glitches, seems to be getting close to finishing. Novavax has already said it can't go forward with its studies. It had started recruiting, but people are dropping out because they want to get the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, and they won't recruit. So early approval, while good and sound from public health purposes to help protect people in the U.S. and the world, is definitely creating experimentation issues about continuing existing trials ethically. Don't we have to let those people drop out and get vaccinated if they wish? And recruiting people to new trials of new vaccines that could be better ones, one-shot vaccines as opposed to the two-shot vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna, less complications in handling them. Both of the Moderna and Pfizer have sort of difficult refrigeration requirements. Maybe the next round of vaccines are cheaper. Estimates are that the Moderna vaccine might be priced at $30, $40 for each shot, maybe $100 for two. That would be beyond the means of many, many countries to access at those prices. And maybe they'll last longer, the next generation or other companies' vaccines. So there is really an issue. How are we going to figure out what's the best vaccine long-term for the world, and which ones perform better and which ones are cheaper? And I'm simply going to say, I don't think we're going to be able to do randomized, placebo-controlled, large-scale studies to answer those questions. We can talk about what we might have to settle for in the question and answer. The other big issue that I want to get into, so I've said something about distrust, and I've said something now about research ethics issues with vaccines. The last one is distribution, who gets it, allocation. There's a U.S. picture, and then there's an international picture. In the U.S., many groups met, many committees. As some of you know, the U.S. is a loose federal system, meaning a lot of authority given to individual states. You might think of it like the European Union on health issues. Individual countries have a lot of discretion. Brussels gives advice, but when it comes to healthcare decisions, Germany, France, Slovenia, whoever, make their own decisions in light of the EU advice. Here it's similar. Washington gives advice, but states like New York, California, Arizona, Nevada ultimately decide what they're going to do. That's good for many healthcare challenges when local authorities have to implement something. It's bad for pandemics if you don't have a universal policy. Then individual states start doing different things, and people in the U.S. start to get nervous that they can't trust the fairness of allocation. For example, in some states, priority was given to people in nursing homes and nursing home staff and healthcare workers. But healthcare workers in hospitals began to get vaccinated even if they weren't seeing patients, even if they were working from home, even if they were very low risk. And so many people said, what's going on? I thought you were trying to take as one principle, vaccinate the people most at risk, which is what CDC and the federal committees had generally recommended. But on the ground, that did not happen right away. We also had situations where our politicians lined up and vaccinated themselves and their families and sometimes their staffs. They said it was to help address the trust issue by showing that they would take the vaccine. More people would be willing to take a vaccine and not refuse it. That was nonsense in my view, complete nonsense. Americans don't trust politicians. I suspect no one in the world really does, but certainly not here, certainly not under Trump. And it looked like they were just pushing to the head of the line, again, undermining public willingness to follow guidelines and consistent policies about who should go first. So in the US, the ideal argument was try to save the most lives with your vaccines, try to get them to the people most at risk of dying, and then preserve the healthcare workforce because you need them both to treat COVID patients and to treat other patients and their high exposure. You don't want that workforce to fall apart. Those were two principles that almost everybody agreed on, and I see a lot of consensus about that worldwide in WHO and UNICEF and other groups that have given their view about priority. But in the US, to be blunt, it has fallen apart. Basically, each state is deciding who to do. Some states are getting more supply of vaccine per citizen population than others. New York is running out right now, even though it has set up a lot of immunization sites. Right next door is a state called Connecticut, where I am today, where I live. They seem to have more vaccine supply. So you can't get it in New York, but you could get it in Connecticut. That gets people angry and nervous, and some are afraid. So we're starting to see people lie about their age. We're starting to see some healthcare immunization sites say, we don't want to be detectives. We're just going to vaccinate whoever shows up. I've seen that in Nevada and Florida. We're starting to see some rich people say, hey, if I give a gift to the hospital, can I get a vaccine? Black market. We're starting to see some people say, if I travel to Florida and get in line there, maybe I could get vaccinated. Some Canadians have done that who are going there for the winter and been vaccinated, even though local people are very angry that that means less vaccine supply for them in Florida. We have seen a lot of idealization from American committees that included ethicists, but very little attention to the practical realities of what would happen if the system was seen as unfair, how to control a high refusal rate. Can you redeploy vaccine? Which we can't because we didn't worry about it. We didn't pay attention to it. So even if you have surplus at a nursing home, you can't get it somewhere else. So then you just start vaccinating everybody who works in the nursing home, including the board of directors and finance people and so on, because you don't know what else to do. And there's no authority to penalize or bring into line states that are just pursuing their own ideas. By the way, we also have issues coming up about should we vaccinate prisoners, people detained as attempting to come into the country illegally, according to the Trump administration. There are outbreaks there. Prisons have big issues about outbreaks because everybody's close together. It's hard to stop the spread of the virus there. And there are even fights about the priority that ought to be given to the mentally ill in institutions. And we see some battles breaking out about who's an essential worker once you get outside healthcare, who really should come next. So all that's fighting. Last comment on the international scene. There's a lot of discussion that if you're going to control a pandemic, you better not just hoard vaccine supply in individual countries. And that makes sense if you know that the vaccine controls spread. If all we know is that the vaccine makes people less sick, then the argument to control the spread of outbreaks wherever they occur weakens. And individual governments in Europe and the US and Canada know this. What they've done is purchased, as I said in advance, big amounts of supply with the intent of vaccinating their own citizens. That policy is called vaccine nationalism. It means protect ourselves, plus if we give it to poor nations or lower middle income nations, it's not going to control the spread yet because we don't know that yet. So we're going to try and save lives in our own country. That has met with a lot of pushback from various international organizations, from the head of the WHO, who keeps saying it's unfair and tragic not to save lives in other places. And the rich have a duty to help the poor in this regard. My own view is I think a version of vaccine nationalism makes sense. And what I mean by that is vaccinate your healthcare workforce in your own country, vaccinate the most at-risk people to prevent deaths, and then start to think about sharing and how you're going to distribute vaccine supply. That said, the screw-ups in the U.S. with respect to the rollout under the Trump administration have been so bad. There's oftentimes right now not enough vaccine in certain states in the U.S. to vaccinate anybody. The idea that the U.S. is going to send vaccine elsewhere, even under Biden, in the short term will not happen. And I think that's basically the view in Canada, and I think that's the view also in Germany and other countries, rich countries. I also think we may work our way out of this in a couple months as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine gets approved. There's a lot of that would help boost the supply. It's easier to handle. It's a one-shot vaccine, doesn't require a lot of refrigeration. We may then start to see serious efforts to share vaccine to other nations. That said, the other thing to pay attention to in sharing is not just give it to poor countries, but where are the outbreaks or where is the virus causing the most harm in poor countries? Not all poor countries have the same level of outbreak and the same level of death. Nobody really understands why, but a country like Kenya doesn't seem to be in as bad a situation as a country like Peru. So even though in the abstract, people say you've got to send vaccine to the poor nations, I think it's going to be likely that those vaccines will get sent to poor or middle income countries that really are facing challenges from COVID. So to repeat, first ethics issue, distrust, and how do you get over that, and how do you conquer that, and what sort of campaigns and education are legitimate. If you can't overcome distrust, I didn't say this, but would you ever force or coerce or mandate someone to take a vaccine if they keep turning it down and you know that you've got to protect them because you need them in the workforce? Second, what are you going to do about research challenges if large-scale studies are going to fall apart and be hard to recruit people to in the future? How will we decide what's safe, what's best with vaccines? And lastly, distribution, which is complicated. A lot of ideal comments have been made by committees, ethicists, groups about who should go first. But when the vaccines have actually gotten to distribution, issues like where the vaccine site is, what local states and authorities are going to do when faced with questions, say, about prisoners or immigrants or vaccinating themselves, or how do you redeploy vaccine that's not being used quickly and easily to high-risk populations? No attention to that, no policies. And what's really going to happen with international sharing if these rich countries still haven't been able to roll out vaccine to protect their most at-risk citizens? Those all remain big ethics issues. So I'll stop there, and I think open it up for some questions from Talia.
So thank you, Art, for a superb, condensed, juicy 20 minutes. You raised a lot of very important issues, and I dare say most of them are issues that we are concerned with in this part of the world. Now, I had a few questions, but out of fairness to my colleagues who are attending, because your talk raises a lot of questions, I'm going to limit them to one now. Now, after Christmas and New Year all over the world, in the US now you have you had the impeachment and then the inauguration, and with Valentine's Day around the corner, one is tempted to argue that those who ignore public health responsibilities during the pandemic and ignore the fact that their freedom ends where the freedom of others begins, by partying, by not respecting social distancing, by not wearing masks and what have you, one might argue that it would be a good idea to track those, make them pay a fine that will go to a special fund that one might create for vaccine and treatment to assist the less well-off. That restaurants who are opening and who have opened for New Year, for example, and allowed hundreds of people to come without masks and what have you, should also be fined for their irresponsibility just to get more material gain. And that these people should be informed that they will be placed last on the priority list of vaccine and treatment should the latter be needed for COVID. Now, of course, this brings me back to arguments related to patients and lung transplants, smokers and liver transplants, lung transplant, alcoholics and liver transplant. But that argument has almost been closed, arguing that smoking and drinking can be labeled as a disease. So what's your take on this, Art?
Yeah, well, that's a very rich question, and to some extent it's come up here. The state near me, New Jersey, recently announced within the past few days a broader expansion of vaccine eligibility, even though the supplies are limited, so I don't know why they're expanding it. They don't have any vaccine to give everybody. But one group that was explicitly included was smokers, because they are at higher risk, and the state said they should get priority over people who aren't smokers at the same age group. And that set off quite a debate about why are we doing that. So a few comments. First, there are many behaviors that people engage in that lead to health problems. They drive too fast, they don't practice safe sexual practices, they use drugs, they drink too much and have accidents, they get obese, they don't exercise. We know it's a long, long list. Nonetheless, despite the fact that many of these people wind up needing health care, diabetes, arthritis, strokes, and on, many, many health problems. We treat them, we put them in the health system. If we wanted to control healthcare costs, and we just took out all the people who were irresponsible and sinners from the health system, we would have almost nobody there except some religious people. Because everybody who winds up there, I'm going to say 60, 70% of them, and that's a guess, got there by some bad choice, bad behavior, something they did that was stupid that made them sick. So I don't think we're going to go to a policy of punishing bad behavior, even in a plague, about not doing social distancing, not doing masking. Our ethic has always been take care of the sick in healthcare and don't try to judge the patient. If you start to do that, it's a road, I think, that has no end, because there are so many people you could accuse of smoking or drinking or not taking care of themselves or operating a motor vehicle irresponsibly or not wearing a helmet on and it goes on and on and on. And everybody will want similar cases to be treated similarly. So I don't think so. I also don't think it's possible to really track the bad behavior. People will lie, people will cover up what they did, will deny it, and it's going to be impossible to really say, oh, well, we know you were at that restaurant and you were close and you didn't wear your mask. It would be tough to go after individuals. Maybe we could go after institutions, restaurants, places that have held parties and try to find them. That might be possible. I'm not sure in a broken economy how much you're going to be able to really get in the way of fines, but it might send a message about still adhering to responsible behavior. But I'll say this, I don't think it's going to be able to be done for individuals. It's too hard to track. It goes against the system, the healthcare ethic of the world that says just treat people, don't judge them. I think many healthcare workers would not want to try to be in the role of saying you're guilty and you're not. They don't know enough about the patients anyway. And you're going to foster deception, lying, bribing, all kinds of behavior to cover up past misbehavior. So maybe something for, as I said, businesses. But again, these businesses are broken. I think politically it would be hard, certainly in the U.S., to say we're going to start finding places when they can barely stay open. People have sympathy for the little businesses. So I don't think so. I don't think we're going to go that way.
So thank you, Art. So before I give it to questions, just one quick argument, because one might easily argue that in the situation of public health crises, particularly now with the shortage of ventilators, why would I give a ventilator to a person who has violated all the requirements to protect himself and others, instead of giving it to someone who is in dire need, who was respecting others and him or herself? So a lot of arguments and counter-arguments I'm sure will emerge.
I mean, just quickly on that one, it's come up. We've discussed it at my hospital, which had a big problem. You remember in New York in March and April, that was a big outbreak for us with a lot of pressure on the health system. There's a lot of pressure in California and Arizona now on their hospitals. They started to get close to triaging and rationing. But again, the overwhelming ethic of medicine has been treat people who need treatment, don't judge them. And I think it's a good ethic. I mean, I think we should respect it. I have suggested that if you misbehaved and chose to not mask or acted like an idiot, then you should volunteer to go to the end of the line. That's different from making the doctor send you there. If you are really taking choice and liberty seriously, then it has consequences. And you should say, if someone needs it more than me, I didn't act responsibly, now I'm sick, I volunteer to go last. I don't think people are going to do it, but that would be the morally right thing to do.
Lot Art. we're opening questions via mic or via chat, and my colleague Diana would be kind enough to raise the questions on chat if there's no one willing to speak via mic. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Wajiha. I'm an ophthalmologist at UBMC, and I have a question about the ethics, I should say, of forcing people to take the vaccine, if they're a healthcare worker. When I was working in the States, the flu vaccine was mandatory. I couldn't go to work without having the flu vaccine, and I'm wondering, we're gonna get a lot of pushback. I think the opposite's going to happen in Lebanon, because we're going to get a lot of pushback because there's a lot of conspiracy theories going on. So if an institution wants to make sure that their staff is safe, and can we do an opt-out versus an opt-in policy? You know what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. It's very funny you should ask me. Some of you on the call on our class today may know I'm the person, along with a doctor named Paul Offit, who invented and pushed for the flu mandate 10 years ago. We first did it when I was in Philadelphia at the Children's Hospital there, and then at the regular hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Those were the first places to require all healthcare workers to get flu shots. It's ironic, the flu shot isn't as effective as the COVID shots that have been approved now. So there's an even stronger case to mandate the COVID vaccines because they work well. So yes, I favor mandating for healthcare workers. We can give exceptions for health reasons, but that would be it for me. I wouldn't let people choose not to do it if they want to work in the institution near patients. I think you have to get vaccinated. If you want to work in an office and mask, I might give you an accommodation for that. But at NYU, with our flu shots mandate, we have 99.7% vaccination. Tiny number of people for health reasons are not vaccinated. We do not accept religious refusals or claims of vegetarianism or worries about some fetal cells being in vaccines or other conspiracy views. And I think we're going to see mandates coming for healthcare workers in particular. The reason we don't see them quite yet is when you approve something as an emergency use on not finished data, it's harder to mandate that. People know that it isn't a licensed vaccine, it hasn't got final approval. As soon as they get there, I think that's when the mandates will start. And I think ethically for healthcare workers, that's the right thing to do, including, by the way, nursing home staff, people who clean the rooms, people who support doctors in the ICU and so on, and eventually maybe even to primary care people who have high exposure to patients. We want to protect them and we want the workforce to be stable.
I totally agree. I was just because I know this is gonna come. Probably it's gonna be on the table in the next few months.
Let me jump in with one more thing about mandated vaccines. The other way I think we're going to see some mandates is not so much the government saying you have to do it, whether it's Lebanon or the U.S. or wherever. What I think will happen is some private companies will begin to mandate, particularly airlines, cruise ships, maybe things like the Channel train. They're going to say, if you want to come into this hotel, you want to come into this airplane, you have to show for vaccination. I'm expecting vaccine passports for travelers. I'm expecting private companies to say, yeah, you can fly, it's safe, or you can go on vacation here, it's safe. And they have an economic interest to force the mandates. Some people will resist it and say, you're taking away my liberty. But, the private company can say, you have no right to come on a private airline. These are our conditions. Either you do it or you don't fly, and we don't care. So I think that's the other way in which mandates will start to appear. Certain businesses that have been very badly hurt because of legitimate fears about COVID are going to start to say, you can trust our business, we're mandating.
Hey, thank you so much.
So do we have any other questions? You can ask by opening your mic.
We can hardly hear you, Diana. So any questions to be asked? Yes. So I'll fill in as usual. Typically, as you noted, in a way, casually, the most pressing questions in relation to vaccines are, should recipients be given the choice to choose the vaccine between AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Chinese, Russian, and even the Cuban vaccine we don't hear people talking about? Should informed consent be a requirement? And whether if vaccine is going to be mandated, would any side effects be considered as a job accident, since the employer is forcing the employee to be vaccinated? So particularly with the laws requiring the immunization of vaccine companies from liability for an injury, at least until 224.
Yeah,
So,
good question.
Yeah. Floor is yours.
So on the liability, I think you should understand that many countries have said to the manufacturers, you will not be liable for any lawsuits about side effects or problems for 3 years. And that's what the question mentioned, and that's true. You will not be able to sue AstraZeneca or Pfizer or anybody. So that means the liability would have to go for mandates to the institution that is mandating. If it's an airline or a cruise ship, as I mentioned, that said you have to show vaccination to use our service, there's no liability there. They can do that. They're not responsible for side effects. They've just set terms and conditions. I don't think you could sue. In the US, we've tried to create a fund to help people who do claim and can show to the conviction of a judge that they had a health issue because of a vaccine, and we need to extend that to the COVID vaccines. I don't want people suing their doctors or suing the hospital for mandates. So what we need is a social insurance fund. We have that actually in the US, in other countries with better national health care. Say Britain, the motivation to sue is a little bit less because your healthcare costs are covered anyway. So yeah, I think we need to extend the safety net to cover costs that might be claimed, but you need a system to evaluate the claims, because many people will just start to say whatever health problem they had must be due to the vaccine, and that is often not true. In terms of the choices among vaccines, this is going to be an emerging issue. I don't have a clear-cut answer to this, but what's going to happen is we're going to have limited information on some of these vaccines because, as I said, the big randomized trials are not going to work. They're going to fall apart because people won't want to be in them because they want to get the emergency use vaccines or the newly approved vaccines. So we have to do this by informed consent and say, here comes company X with a new vaccine. It's one shot. They say they have a reason to think, based on real-world evidence, not a big trial, but just studying people that they give it to versus the existing vaccines, that theirs is better. That's weaker evidence, but it is only one shot, and it might be cheaper for you to get. And so you have a choice of which one you want to take. The next reality is, depending on where you live in the world, you're only going to get one kind of vaccine because that's the one that'll get shared. Remember I mentioned that Johnson & Johnson has a lot of vaccine. I suspect that's the one that's going to many countries, and there won't be a choice, even though there'll be other vaccines available in other parts of the world. You may see some rich people trying to fly or travel to where they think a better vaccine is. But in general, let's say, I don't know, Peru is going to get one vaccine, and that's going to be it. And even though there are other vaccines, they won't. Third, there's going to be some call to test some of these vaccines in countries that don't have anything, because people will say better to test a vaccine in a very, very poor place, Liberia, making up a place, than not have anything at all. So we'll get into arguments about whether that's exploitation. Can the rich countries vaccinate people? The middle-income countries do that. But then tell the poor, well, all you can get is the new vaccine we're trying to test and a placebo. I don't think that's actually going to work, but I think we're going to have a fight about that. So much to say about vaccine choices. Going to become a really big issue, I think, in a few months into the summer as we move away from shortage of vaccine supply into choice of vaccine.
So thank you, Art. Any other question? I can see your beautiful furry friend hovering around in the kitchen. Probably waiting.
My dog Rory, collie, as he says.
So there were a couple of
unless you're watching my unless you're watching my nephew as a furry friend, he wanders around the kitchen too.
I did see him, but I don't think he's the furry friend.
Yeah, not as furry. That's furry.
So Diana?
Yes, there were a couple of about the mutation, the mutations that are coming up, and I guess a couple of people are asking how is this going to change regarding the vaccine and the research as well.
Yeah, good question. And the answer to that is we're not sure. It's clear that the virus, as many viruses do, mutates. Some do it slowly, slow mutation. Example of a slowly mutating virus might be Ebola. Some do it moderately, flu. And this one seems to be doing it moderately as well. I wouldn't say it's fast. But viruses, as many of you know, have evolved so that the best way for them to stay alive is to randomly change and see whether if humans develop protections against one type of strain of a vaccine or subtype, then another version of that same virus can live because it slightly alters its genetic makeup. These alterations can affect a couple of things. One, ease of transmission, easier to catch it. Two, make it worse to get. It kills you faster. Viruses don't tend to want to kill their hosts, slows them down. So the changes tend to be there are transmission ones, not as much deadlier. So that's good news and bad news. Even if it changes, the virus, say COVID, is more likely to become more infective, but it's not likely to change to be more lethal. Again, you're killing your host. It's hard to transmit. You undercut your ability as a virus to live if you kill all the hosts. So transmission, we don't know the answer to whether these vaccines we now have, Pfizer and Moderna, protect. They're studying that. There's some early feedback I'm getting from the companies that they think the vaccines do give broader protection against mutations, but we're not really sure. It is a reason to understand that even if vaccines become widely available in the summer or fall of this year, we're still going to have to mask and social distance and do remote learning in some instances and so on, because we may have more easy to catch, more infective strains still rattling around out there. So I don't think we're going to be on top of this thing given these mutations until next year. Vaccines will help. Hopefully they'll work against more mutations, but we don't know it. We're going to have to prove it.
Okay, thank you. And another
you have another question, Diana? I guess, yes, go.
Sorry about that because I had a bit of lag. Yes, we have a question from Hazoer about public distrust and what are the possible solutions or approaches to increase public trust, knowing that sometimes even the awareness campaigns and educations are not yielding the expected results.
It's a very difficult question. I'm going to offer a complaint. We have spent a lot of money in the US and in other countries to really speed up vaccine discovery, research, and production. That's good. We have spent next to nothing to figure out what strategies, tactics work best to overcome distrust. Very little behavioral study, very little study of marketing. It's ironic, I keep telling my colleagues here around the country, we have all kinds of people who know how to sell us candy and beer and socks and Peloton bicycles and internet subscriptions to streaming services, but we have nobody with the same skills working on how to overcome public distrust of vaccines. So that said, I think we should spend more to answer that question, but we have to involve more people from the world of marketing and business in overcoming distrust. They know how to do it. They're very good at advertising. They know how to message, and we're not using them. We have to integrate them into programs in Lebanon, the US, and elsewhere. Second, we have to work with the platform people, the social media people, to get misinformation off. It's dangerous. And if they're going to really say that you can't use Facebook or TikTok or whatever it is to promulgate violence or to promulgate harm, then some of the messaging that's up there about vaccines should come off. It's not a censorship. It's just we have to take off misinformation, lying that could kill people. And then the third step, I think, is to work with different communities, get more diversity so that both religious, ethnic, cultural, racial spokespersons can come out and support vaccination, trusted figures. And that usually isn't politicians. Remember, I made fun of the idea that politicians would get you to trust vaccines. I think we need to hear religious leaders speak up, particularly in countries like Lebanon, with so diverse, and try to get them involved in social media, television, media campaigns, community education, that sort of thing. I think trust will come from peer education. By the way, I'm laughing. In the background right now, they're inaugurating Biden. I'm listening. My nephew has on the television. He's working from home with me here in Connecticut, and they're playing all the music to get him in. And I have to personally say my politics is, boy, I'm so happy. Can't wait for Trump to be gone and this guy to come in.
I hope he will live up to your expectations, Art. Now, I know you have to...
Couldn't be worse disappointment.
Yeah, I know you have to leave in like 5 minutes, so I'm going to throw at you the last question, if I may. As ethicists, looking at vaccines as, in a way, quasi-experimental, since not enough experiment and data has been generated. So they are still, whether we like it or not, quasi-experimental. So how ethically acceptable for the pharmaceutical companies to accept zero liability in case of side effects? And should we, the ethics, if you want, world group, remain silent about this?
Yeah, good question. I think, first of all, they are experimental, and I wouldn't deny that. They have not been licensed. They're not approved. We're getting availability on early data, but we don't have any final licensing. And I don't think the studies are going to finish, as I keep saying, because I think people are dropping out of them to just go get the vaccine. The emergency use authorization in the U.S. and in United Arab Emirates and in Britain and in other countries, Saudi, has been basically you don't need informed consent. You vaccinate people and you give them what's called an information sheet. Here's the vaccine. Here's what we know about it. Here's what to watch for. We should be doing more informed consent. It's experimental. We should be saying that more clearly to people. Lastly, and ironically, if you have an experimental agent out there, it's very difficult to win a lawsuit if you get hurt. You might argue you didn't get good informed consent, but generally speaking, most countries say you can't really get compensated by a lawsuit for use of experimental agents because there's no standard of care, because it's not approved. How's that for crazy? So we need to be sure that we have compensation policies for research subjects in place. Some countries do, some countries don't. It's all over the place. I'll send you a paper if you send me an email that we did just a couple of months ago, looking at India, the US, and many other countries on their compensation for human subjects in research when they get harmed. But that is a loophole or a problem in human experimentation. We haven't got strong programs to help anybody who got injured in an experiment. And I don't know what Lebanon's is. I don't know.
Well, we have nothing so but the policy is that if there are any side effects, of course minor, they will be covered by the Ministry of Health, since it's the ministry that will be disposing, that will be giving the vaccines. But you know that economically the country is
Yeah.
below what it needs to be, so I'm not sure how compensation will take place. So,
Yeah.
well, on note of economic crisis and crises in politics, go enjoy the Biden inauguration.
I'm gonna go look at it and be happy for a few minutes.
Yeah, and thanks a lot, Art, for your time. Much obliged.
Thank you, everybody.
Stay-
If people had a question they didn't get to ask, just email it to me. Diana, you can send me. I'll try to answer a question, and happy to supply you with articles and papers. I've written on all these things recently, so you're
That's
welcome.
super. Thanks a lot.
Sure, that
Maybe
would be
Diana will collect the questions and she will send them to you, Art.
Definitely. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Inauguration. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.